Republican leadership says it's prepared to set the rules for an impeachment trial without Democratic support. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell made the announcement Tuesday. He says there are enough senators in favor of starting proceedings and then waiting to address the possibility of additional witnesses and documents. McConnell says he'd like to follow the precedent set by the Clinton trial.
All we're doing here is saying we're going to get started in exactly the same way that 100 senators agreed to 20 years ago. What's good for President Clinton is good for President Trump. We'll get around to the discussion of witnesses. We got around to the discussion of witnesses after we got through phase one 20 years ago.
That is the opposite of what Democrats would like to see happen. Negotiations over the trial have been stalled for weeks, in part over this very issue. For more, let's bring in James Arkin on Capitol Hill. He's a Senate campaigns reporter for Politico. Thanks very much, James, for being with us. We just heard the majority leader there. Is there any end in sight for this stalemate over an impeachment trial?
Yeah, it seems like there is an end in sight. I mean, this is an indication from Mitch McConnell that Republicans are unified, that once Nancy Pelosi and House Democrats send the articles of impeachment over to the Senate, Republicans are going to start up the trial and that they have the votes to do that without coming to a consensus with Democrats, without coming to any sort of agreement on witnesses like Democrats had been hoping to pressure them into doing. And so, it's still unclear when the impeachment articles are going to be sent over, but this is a clear indication that Mitch McConnell has the support of the Republican conference up here and all the Republican senators, or enough Republican senators, to get started without any deal on potential witnesses.
I want to zoom out just a bit. So Democrats only need to net 3 seats to take control of the chamber, and I know you reported on this. How are vulnerable Republicans navigating impeachment to keep their seats?
Vulnerable Republicans have really, so far, there hasn't been any signs of a lot of breakage within the party. They've been very critical of the process that the House took on impeachment. Most of the vulnerable Republicans in states that kind of lean red, North Carolina, which is a battleground state, Iowa, Texas, even Georgia, some of these states that are going to be potentially competitive next year, they're saying House Democrats ran through a political process and they're not really budging. They're not talking about potential witnesses. Now, you do have some cases like Susan Collins in Maine. She has not said that she wants to see witnesses. Democrats have been putting a lot of pressure on her, and she has sort of sided with what Mitch McConnell has said, which is, let's get the trial started, let's deal with witnesses the way they did in 1999 later on. But Democrats are trying to put a ton of pressure on these Republican senators and try and make, any potential votes, any potential decisions about witnesses sort of as painful as possible, any votes as painful as possible for these senators. But so far, not a lot of signs that any of these vulnerable Republicans are breaking with their party on it.
Well, on the other side of the aisle, several Democratic candidates in some battleground states have not gone so far as to call for the president's actual removal from office. So what fine line is the party walking when it comes to messaging here?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've seen sort of universally from both Democratic incumbents who are going to be on the ballot running for re-election and for the party's preferred candidates in all of these Senate seats that I was just talking about. They're saying they supported the House's impeachment inquiry. They're putting pressure on senators, Republicans. They're calling for a fair trial. They're calling for administration witnesses to testify. They are not yet calling for Donald Trump's removal. They are sort of being a little more cautious about that. They're waiting for the trial to take place. They're not getting out ahead of it. It's sort of put them in a precarious balancing position because a lot of them do have challengers, other Democrats running in these primaries who are running as more stalwart progressives who are already calling for removal in some of these states. And so that puts a little bit of pressure on them. But to be honest, talking to Democrats in these states, talking to, campaign strategists, they feel like this is the right position for these challengers in these Democratic senators to be in. They shouldn't be getting out ahead of the trial. They're going to have to come down one way or another if the Senate is going to take a vote on removal to say where they would stand on that. That's going to be the case for these trial, but for these candidates. But they're not facing a ton of internal party pressure right now to get out ahead of the trial and call for Donald Trump's removal.
And I know you've reported on how the trial is dividing grassroots Democrats. How are progressive primary challengers using impeachment to hit moderate Democrats?
Yeah, they're basically saying this is, evidence that some of these Democratic candidates, some of these moderate Democrats aren't, they're being too cautious. They're being too careful. You have primary opponents in states like North Carolina, Colorado, Texas, who are going up against the party's preferred candidates, and they're saying, I'm already calling for removal. We've already seen enough evidence that Donald Trump committed impeachable offenses. We shouldn't be waiting for the trial. The evidence is right there. And so they're using this sort of to show that they're the stronger progressive in the race and try and gain some momentum among the party's base, try and, gin up some momentum for their campaign bids. Now, whether or not that will work ultimately, it's questionable. The party has their preferred candidates in these races, and they're being a little bit more cautious whether they ultimately get to removal or not, or whether some of these candidates, split with their primary opponents. That's when I think we could really start to see a division in the party. But right now, it's just about these progressive candidates who are calling for removal, trying to gain a little bit of momentum, trying to get out ahead of this a little bit.
Well, finally, keeping with 2020, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo will not run for Senate. He was considering launching a bid for an open seat in Kansas. Do we know what led to his decision?
Yeah, I mean, Mitch McConnell and Senate Republican leadership had been pretty open for months that they've been recruiting Mike Pompeo for the Senate seat. They thought that he was going to give the party the best chance to keep this seat in Republican hands. They're a little bit worried about the primary that they might face if he didn't run. But the developments over the past couple of days in Iran just sort of made things clear that it would have been very difficult for Mike Pompeo to leave the State Department to run a political campaign. He's obviously been out there giving the administration's message after the airstrike in Iran, and he's been sort of very forward and very public in defending the administration's actions. And so it just creates a situation where it really wasn't tenable for Mike Pompeo to depart. And he's said all along that he was going to remain Secretary of State as long as President Trump was going to allow him. And so he sort of said today, this is nothing new. This is just what I've said all along, that I want to continue to be Secretary of State. But he did deliver that message to Mitch McConnell yesterday. And so it seems, at least right now, to be a definitive situation that Mike Pompeo has taken himself out of the running for that.
At least right now, because as you noted in your piece, there's still time for him to change his mind, right, James?
Yeah, absolutely. If the filing deadline for the seat is June 1st, if we're in mid-May and there's a situation where it looks like Republicans are in danger of nominating someone who could put the seat in jeopardy, I think a lot of Republicans here in Washington and in Kansas think that Mike Pompeo could ultimately change his mind. He could run, and even if he announced the day before that filing deadline, he could put together a campaign very quickly that would be very formidable. So, he's said that he's going to stay as Secretary of State. Republicans are sort of taking that as such today, but obviously a lot of time for things to change out there.
All right, so much intrigue potentially. All right, James Arkin, thank you very much, James.
Thank you.